The single father opened the door of the house he had just bought for $1, then froze in place. A little girl who had been tied up for 3 weeks, her arms clutching a worn teddy bear, sat beside a bowl of rice, now covered in mold. Who had kept her imprisoned for 3 weeks? And why were they determined to take her back at any cost? And would this single father protect her to the very end? Michael Carter was 35 years old, a single father. It had been 2 years since his wife passed away, and in that time, he had been both a father and a friend to his 8-year-old son, Ethan. Every morning, he drove Ethan to school, and every evening he cooked a simple meal himself, then told his son a few small stories to steady his own heart. Recently, he had signed the papers to buy Pinewood Cabin for exactly $1, seeing it as a clean new start for the two of them after a long stretch of weariness. His old car rumbled through the rows of pines in Redwood State Forest, the engine's low growl steady if a bit rough. When he stopped in front of the weathered porch, he opened the door, looked over at his 8-year-old son, and said slowly but firmly, "From now on, this will be our new home." Ethan rose on his toes to peer through the dust-covered window. His eyes lighting up, he immediately asked, "Do I get my own room, Dad? Can I put up dinosaur stickers?" Michael chuckled at his son's eagerness. He was about to joke that it might cost a few baseball player stickers in trade before he agreed. But at that moment, a sound came from deep inside the house, very faint. Not the wind, it was like a stifled sniffle, the breathing of someone trying to hide. The air suddenly felt heavier, enough to change the look on his face. Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder, signaling for him to stay behind. He stepped inside slowly, each stride deliberate. The soles of his shoes pressed against the dry wooden floorboards, producing small, hollow creaks. His heartbeat stayed calm but taut, the same as when he jogged in the mornings to keep his mind sharp. His eyes scanned over the moldy wall patches, a broken-legged table, a stack of old boxes that still smelled of dampness. The faint sniffle came again, as if in answer to his presence, and he knew the two of them were not alone in here. "Is someone in there?" Michael called softly, keeping his voice low so Ethan wouldn't be frightened. He angled his body away from the broken window pane, keeping a safe distance, and then he saw her at the base of a wooden post out on the back porch. She was a girl of about 8, her left wrist bound tightly with a frayed rope, her right arm wrapped around a dirty, gray-stained teddy bear. Beside her sat a bowl of leftover rice gone completely white with mold. Her wide eyes were locked on his face, a mix of guarded fear and raw desperation. Michael lowered his voice further. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." He knelt until he was at eye level with her. "Who did this to you?" There was no answer, only short, broken breaths. The teddy bear was clutched tighter, as if it were her final shield. So he extended his hand slowly, giving her time to see each movement. From his pocket, he pulled out a folding knife, slid the blade carefully beneath the knot, and began cutting the rope strand by strand until it fell away to the floor. Old marks layered over new ones, the deep purple bruises on her wrist showing she had been tied for weeks. Michael turned his palm upward so the girl could see his hand was empty, then said, "Let's go outside and get some fresh air." He waited for a nod, even the smallest one. She didn't nod, but she didn't pull away either. Her body trembled like a leaf touched by wind, and when he reached out, she still clutched the stuffed bear, knees pressed tightly together in a defensive habit. Even so, she allowed him to lift her. She was so light that Michael felt his throat tighten. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide in a mix of shock and sympathy at what he was seeing. He opened his mouth as if to ask, "What's your name?" But Michael put a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Ethan understood instantly, stepped back to give room, then ran to open the truck door without thinking twice. That small reflex to help warmed Michael's chest in the middle of the tension pressing in on them. Out on the porch, the heat radiated up from the dry ground. Michael set the girl in the back seat, pulled Ethan's thin blanket over her shoulders, and said, "Have a little water." He placed the bottle in her tiny, cold, dry hand. She touched the bottle to her lips so lightly, her eyes never leaving him, as if any sudden movement could be a threat. Ethan sat close enough to be near, but kept a respectful distance. He spoke slowly. "It's okay. We're just going back to our old place first." Michael turned back to lock the door of the cabin. He planned to report to the town sheriff once the girl was settled. As he bent down to pick up the cut rope to keep as evidence, a sharp snap of a dry branch echoed from the edge of the forest behind him, clear, deliberate. He spun around instantly, scanning the straight trunks of the redwoods. The sunlit air was still, no sign of anyone, but the sensation of being watched clung to the back of his neck like a thin sheet of ice. Holding the rope, he backed toward the truck, opened the driver's door without taking his eyes off the dark stretch of forest. Sweat dampened his palms from the sudden, unnatural silence, and he knew this wasn't the end. Someone knew exactly what this cabin was, knew he had carried a child out of it, and knew the road he would take back to the old house. When he started the engine, the girl tightened her grip on the stuffed bear. The blanket slipped from her shoulder, revealing the deep groove on her wrist. Michael saw it and felt his chest cinch as if a rope had been drawn around it. Ethan saw it too and laced his fingers together in worry. Outside, the redwoods began to murmur, as if whispering a question that had no easy answer. Michael eased onto the gas to leave the clearing, but kept listening, because that sound of the branch snapping still seemed to hang in the air. In his mind, "Here, what I bought for $1 wasn't just a house." The door closed, and the cool air inside seemed to be listening. Samantha Brooks sat with her back against the wall, knees drawn close to her chest, her eyes scanning each corner as if searching for an escape route. Her gaze flicked quickly, then stopped at the front door, the windowsill, and the worn wooden chair. The stuffed bear still rested firmly in her right hand, her fingers gripping the frayed fabric so tightly that another small seam had split open. Michael Carter took off his jacket and hung it on the hook. Speaking in a tone neither high nor low, he kept the atmosphere steady for everyone. "Take a little rest, and then we'll have a snack." Ethan Carter nodded, glancing at the girl before pulling a chair closer to the table, every movement slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. Standing just out of her sight, he leaned toward his father and whispered, "We're going to keep her, right, Dad?" Michael looked at his son, paused for half a second, and replied clearly, "Only until we know for sure she's safe." He poured water into a glass and placed it in front of her with unhurried care. "Have a little water." Samantha didn't look at him but at the glass instead, her fingers brushing lightly against its rim, trembling slightly before setting it down as though afraid she'd done something wrong. Michael didn't push her. He pulled a chair at an angle so she could maintain her space and added, "No one's going to punish you here." The musty smell from her clothes drifted faintly, the scent of dirt clinging after too many days, pulling Michael's mind back to the rope he had just cut. He noticed the dark stains at the hem of her dress, the purplish marks still pressed into her wrists, the matted strands of her hair. Opening a cabinet, he took out Ethan's thin blanket, set it beside her, and said softly, "If you get cold, you can wrap up in this." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes glancing at the blanket before returning to her bear as if everything else around her was foreign. Ethan slid his toy box out from under the table, picked a small red car with a strip of paint chipped away, and crouched a safe distance from her. "This one's really fast." He gave it a gentle push. The wheels rolled one short loop before stopping between them. Samantha didn't reach for it, but her eyes flicked over it for just a second quick, like a reflex she couldn't quite hold back before retreating again to the safety of her stuffed bear. Ethan didn't seem bothered. He pulled the car back toward him. "Whenever you want, we can trade cars." Michael brought out a piece of sweet bread he'd bought that morning at the market, broke it into smaller pieces, and set them on a plate in front of her along with a little warm milk. His voice was low and steady. "You can take it one bite at a time if you want." She glanced up for a brief moment, her eyes meeting his before pulling away again. Her right hand stayed wrapped tightly around the bear, while her left hesitated for a beat before picking up a small piece of bread. No one spoke further. The only sounds were the quiet swallows and steady breathing. Michael kept track of her pace as though counting, not staring so as not to make her feel pressured, but knowing each bite that passed her throat was a long journey in itself. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Michael asked in a calm voice, careful to avoid words that might make her think about the rope. Samantha didn't answer. Her left hand moved instinctively to her wrist, as if to hide it, then quickly lowered again. Ethan noticed and pulled a star-shaped sticker from his toy box, setting it next to her plate. "If you put this on the sore spot, it might feel better. At least it'll look nicer." She didn't take it, but her eyes lingered on the golden star, a second longer than before. The afternoon passed slowly. Michael tidied up a few small things around the house, speaking to Ethan loudly enough for the girl to hear about how they'd be stopping by Sheriff Daniel Hayes' office tomorrow to file a report, and how people here looked out for one another. He didn't mention fear. He spoke about safety rules, about adding new latches to the windows, about how tonight the three of them would sleep on the same floor so they could hear each other breathe. Those small details were like anchor stakes, something he planted firmly to keep the room steady in the girl's mind. Ethan sat on the floor, rolling a toy car in a small circle before stopping it right in front of her shoes. "You can try holding it if you want," he said softly. She looked at the car, pressed her lips together, glanced up for a moment, then lowered her gaze. Her left hand shifted half an inch forward, then drew back. The car stayed where it was. Michael resisted the urge to encourage her, knowing that on the first day, crossing just one small line was enough. He changed the subject with a safe, open question. "What's your teddy bear's name?" There was no answer, just her hand tightening slightly, as if that name had once been taken from her. The evening light faded slowly, and the room grew softer. Michael gathered the dishes, told Ethan to wash his hands, then folded the blanket on the couch. He set a second glass of water down, this time a little closer to her, and returned to his seat. His voice was as light as a breeze. "If you get thirsty, you can drink this." Samantha touched the rim of the glass with her fingertips, held them there for a few seconds, then let go a small movement, but her hand didn't tremble like it had earlier. Ethan bent low, whispering to his dad as he passed by. "Do you think she's scared of us?" Michael shook his head slightly. "She just doesn't know who we are yet." Ethan thought for a moment, then nodded. "Then we'll wait." He fetched the same blanket, spread half of it over the couch beside her, and said, "It's softer here if you want to sit." She didn't move, but her eyes paused at the blanket's edge, as if weighing something she couldn't yet name. Night fell. Michael checked the windows and back door, testing each latch and the inside locks. Every sound was clear in the quiet house. He turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the living room lamp on. Ethan lay on the couch, pulling the blanket up to his chest, facing the girl so she'd see he was there. Michael sat in the chair across from her, speaking just loudly enough to be heard but not to press. "We'll sleep here tonight. If you need something, you can tell me, or you don't even have to. Just look over, and I'll understand." The clock's hand moved forward a single mark. Michael stood, reached to switch off the living room lamp so they could rest, and the darkness drew in like a thin curtain. In that instant, outside the glass, a figure slid past so quickly it was only the faint outline of a shoulder and a hat. Michael flicked the light back on immediately, stepping to the window, scanning the yard. It was empty, but the air still held the echo of a breath that had just been pulled away. He didn't call out, didn't open the door. He turned back, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder, then looked at Samantha. She was sitting upright now, eyes fixed on the window, lips pressed tight, hands clutching her teddy bear until her knuckles turned white. Michael lowered his voice even further. "It's all right. I'll always be here." His heartbeat was steady, his ears tuned to every sound, and in his mind there was only one short thought tight as a rope knot pulled firm. The next morning, Michael woke up early, lit a small fire in the kitchen stove, and checked the window latches, running his hand over each lock as if telling them they needed to hold tighter than they had the night before. Ethan woke up, rubbed his eyes, looked around, and then turned toward the little girl sitting quietly on the chair by the wall. "I'll stay with her, Dad. You go get the groceries and come right back," he said softly. Michael knelt down, put a hand on his son's shoulder, and spoke slowly so both children could hear clearly. "Remember the rules. Don't open the door for anyone. If there's a knock, you ask, 'Who is it?' If it's not me, you stay silent. I'll be back soon." Samantha hugged her worn teddy bear tightly, eyes fixed on the edge of the table. She gave the slightest nod. Michael slid the inner bolt into place, left the house through the front porch, and glanced back one more time before stepping into his truck. Hope Street Market was moderately busy, the smell of hot coffee and fresh pastries drifting from the first stall, mingling with the sound of conversations and the rhythmic clink of knives against cutting boards. Michael headed straight for the produce counter run by a stout, middle-aged woman with neatly pinned hair and quick but warm eyes. Everyone knew her as Martha Jenkins. She had a habit of wrapping orders while making a bit of polite small talk. "What do you need today?" she asked. Michael listed off rice, beans, a little sugar, and milk, plus a few nails and a loaf of sweet bread for the kids. Martha gave him a brief look, noting his tired expression, then lowered her voice. "You look short on sleep. Was it a windy night?" Michael nodded, saying nothing more. He laid the money on the counter and asked her to wrap everything tightly so it would be easier to carry. When Martha stepped into the back to get the milk, Michael felt a pair of eyes fixed on him. He looked up, At the stall across the aisle stood a man in his 40s, wearing a neatly tailored shearling coat, spotless shoes, and well-combed hair. He stood with his arms folded, as if in no hurry. His face carried little expression, but his eyes were cold and calculating. He stared at Michael longer than normal, then walked toward him with deliberate, measured steps, stopping right in front of him as if the market floor were his own porch. His voice was low, just enough for the two of them to hear. "You have something of mine." Michael didn't move, only tilted his head slightly. "What exactly do you mean?" The man's mouth curved in a thin smirk, as if reminding him of something obvious. "The girl. I raised her, and she's coming back with me." Each word fell lightly, but they chilled the air around the stall. Inside, Martha had just come back out with the milk. She froze for half a second when she heard "the girl," her eyes flicking quickly from Michael to the man. A flash of worry crossed her face before vanishing, as if it had never been there. Michael kept his gaze on the man, his hand tightening on the bag's handle until the tendons stood out, though his voice stayed steady. "Who are you talking about? I haven't taken anything from you." The man gave a short, quiet laugh and shook his head, as if bored with the resistance. "The way you carried her out of that cabin yesterday was clumsy. Anyone standing at the edge of the woods could see. She's been with me long enough that I know exactly how she walks. Bring her back to where she belongs." He spoke the words "where she belongs," as if describing an item that had been placed on the wrong shelf. Martha set the milk on the counter, her hand lingering on the bag for a moment before she spoke, almost as if to change the subject. "Do you need salt too?" Michael understood she was giving him a moment to breathe. "Yes, please. A small bag," he replied. Then he turned back to the man. "In your care, someone tied a child's hands and left a moldy bowl of rice beside her. That's not called raising." The man's expression didn't change. He only shrugged. "You don't understand. She's special, and someone like you can't handle that." He leaned in half a step closer, a faint trace of cold cologne in the air. "I'll say this once more. Bring her back. I'll leave you alone." Michael straightened up, his eyes never leaving the other man. "In my home, children eat hot meals and sleep in peace. She will stay there until she's safe." For the first time, a flicker of irritation flashed in the man's eyes, thin but real. He tugged at his sleeve, revealing a steel-faced watch on his wrist, his finger tapping lightly against the bezel as if counting down the time Michael had left. "My name is Victor Grant," he said, as if it were a debt being called in. "You'll be hearing my name more than once if you're not wise enough to listen to me." Martha Jenkins gave a small cough, pushing the grocery bag toward Michael. "That's everything," she said. As Michael took it, she added in a voice so low it could have been meant for the bag itself, "Go straight out the back. Don't use the main entrance." Her eyes dropped for a moment, avoiding Victor's gaze. He noticed the gesture, the corner of his mouth curling ever so slightly. He understood his presence was enough to make people change their path. He tilted his head a little more, like someone catching the scent of fear. "See? Everyone knows better." Michael turned without lowering his head. "The only thing I know is you just admitted to me you were watching us from the tree line. So listen carefully. Stay away from my home." He spoke slowly and clearly, as if hammering each nail into wood. Victor stared at him for a long beat, then stepped back half a pace, brushed an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve, and smiled again. "Then I'll get close to you. At your house. At your living room window. On your porch," he said, in the same tone someone might use to choose a bottle of wine. "I'm coming to take her back. Don't make me knock twice." Victor turned his back and strolled down the market aisle as if he'd just closed a business deal. A few vendors stepped aside. No one said a word. Martha bit her lip, gripping the edge of her apron until her fingers went white. She leaned in, her voice urgent but quiet. "You shouldn't go back through the main road, and it's best not to let the child outside today. I don't know everything, but I've heard people asking about a little girl since this morning." Michael tightened his grip on the bag. "Thank you," he said. Martha nodded and handed him a small packet. "This is a good luck charm I keep on hand. Folks like to hang it by the door for peace of mind. Hang it or not, just keep it." Following her advice, Michael left through the back. He didn't look over his shoulder, but his ears still caught the even, measured sound of footsteps ahead of him, as if they lingered in the market even after the man himself had gone. He climbed into his truck, set the bag on the passenger seat, glanced in the rearview mirror, and let out a short breath. In his head, he ran through the steps. Take the long way home. Check every lock. Call Sheriff Daniel Hayes. Tell Ethan to stay away from the windows. warned Samantha not to open the door if she heard a strange knock. Hope for calm, but prepare for anything. As the truck turned past the last row of stalls, sunlight flared across the windshield, making his eyes sting for a split second. In that moment, Victor's words replayed in his ears, hitting every syllable and leaving that same frightening gap between periods. "I'm coming to take her back. Don't make me knock twice." Michael returned home through the back way, just as Martha Jenkins had told him. He set the grocery bag down in the kitchen and checked every latch on the doors. He hung the small charm she had given him on the window frame. Whether it worked or not didn't matter, as long as it eased his mind. He had Ethan repeat the safety rules one more time. The boy nodded quickly, then pulled a blanket up over himself on the couch. Samantha sat close to the fireplace, clutching her teddy bear, her eyes fixed on the living room window as if she were standing watch for the whole house. Night wind slid over the roof tiles, and the sound of pine needles brushing together was like a soft wave. Ethan drifted off to sleep after just a few short stories about baking the next day. Michael sat across from the girl, speaking slowly to keep the mood steady. "I'm right here. You can close your eyes when you're tired." Samantha gave a small shake of her head, pulling the pillow tighter against herself, still staring outside with an unblinking gaze stretched taut like a drawn string. A faint rustle came from the north wall, followed by slow footsteps circling the porch. The window rattled softly, as if someone had just tested it. Michael pressed a finger to his lips. She understood and stayed exactly as she was. He stood, opened the cabinet, took out his handgun, released the safety, and moved step by step toward the front door. He didn't switch on any more lights, not wanting to cast his shadow, but he angled himself to the side of the doorway so he could see the porch clearly. A figure came into focus as the wind lifted the mesh curtain. Victor Grant stood in the center, wearing a dark fur coat, his eyes cold and steady as if he'd just strolled through a night market. To his left was Derek Lawson, tall, lean, with a rifle slung over his shoulder, his lips pressed tight like someone accustomed to waiting for orders. To his right was Travis Cole, shorter, solid, silent, with a steel-bladed knife on his belt, one hand tucked halfway into his jacket as if ready to draw at any moment. The three of them stood on the porch like they owned the place. Victor gave a faint smile. "Hand her over, and you'll have peace." His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed heavy enough to carry its contempt. Michael didn't open the door. Speaking through the wood, his tone was even and firm. "No one belongs to you." He raised the barrel of his gun a fraction, steady in his grip, his eyes never leaving the three figures outside. Derek lifted one shoulder slightly, his right hand resting loosely on the rifle stock out of habit, his eyes flicking toward the window where the curtain had just shifted. Michael's barrel swung toward him instantly, the motion sharp and precise like a nail driven straight into its groove. "Don't." Michael's word was short, but it carried enough weight to stop that hand mid-motion. Travis didn't speak. He lifted the tip of his boot slightly and tilted his head to peer through the gap, the knife at his hip catching just enough light to reveal half the blade. Michael shifted half a step to block the view into the living room, keeping his distance from the doorframe. The night's still long. Victor smiled, his gaze flicking toward the small charm hanging on the frame. "Hanging that thing won't change anything. You just need to understand where it really belongs." Michael didn't answer. He could hear Ethan's breathing from the other room and could picture Samantha's wide eyes fixed on the darkness. He repeated himself, this time more firmly. "Get off my porch." The air tightened, a draft slipping through, carrying the damp scent of earth and pine. Derek edged forward another half step, his fingers brushing the grip of his rifle as if testing the reaction. Michael's barrel moved faster than thought, locking squarely on the left side of his chest. "I'm not saying it a second time," Michael said, his voice clipped. Inside, a log cracked sharply in the fireplace, the small, crisp sound freezing the porch for a beat. Victor was the one to ease up first. He exhaled a thin breath, giving a small wave of his hand as though pausing a negotiation. "All right, you've held your line well tonight." He turned halfway as if to leave, then leaned in with words smooth as silk but cold as steel. "I'll be back, and next time I won't give warning." The three figures stepped back toward the edge of the yard, boots crunching over gravel before fading into the wind. Michael waited until the porch was completely empty before slowly stepping inside. He locked the top bolt, then the bottom, slid in the extra bar lock, and dragged a heavy wooden cabinet against the door. He moved along each window, checking every latch again, his eyes drifting now and then toward the fireplace. Samantha was still in the same spot, back pressed to the wall, chin slightly lifted, eyes wide and fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. The stuffed bear in her arms was wrinkled from her tight grip, her fingers pale from the pressure. Michael sat across from her, careful not to touch her so she wouldn't startle, but speaking slowly and clearly as if laying a bridge. "They're gone. It's just us here now." She didn't look at him, but her small shoulders lowered just a little. Her lips pressed together as if holding something back, maybe a sob, maybe an old name. Ethan shifted in his sleep, pulling the blanket up a bit higher, his breathing settling into an even rhythm. The fire in the hearth flared once and then stilled. Outside, the night thickened by another shade, and the wind changed direction as though someone had just walked past the edge of the woods. Samantha kept looking that way, her eyes never leaving the darkness. In that long, taut gaze was something very old, something she had never lost. That shadow had once taken everything from her. Morning crept in through the window. The room cleared of the smell of last night's smoke. Michael Carter woke early, put a small pot of water on to boil, then spread a towel across the table. He set down a smooth piece of pine wood and a small knife on the chair where Samantha Brooks usually sat. Lowering his voice so she could hear clearly, he said, "If you want, you can give it a try. I'll be right here." The girl looked at the wood, her eyes resting on the blade for a brief moment before retreating to the stuffed bear in her arms, holding it tight as if afraid it might slip away. Ethan Carter crawled down onto the rug, pulled a few wood scraps from the box leftovers from what his dad had cut the day before, and began arranging them in a ring, patiently rotating them to shape a ball. Every few minutes, he glanced up at her, as if silently asking if she wanted to touch it. Samantha said nothing. Sometimes her eyes flickered toward his hands. Other times they pulled back to the edge of her shirt. Her breathing was becoming steadier, but still shallow. Michael sat off to the side, shaving the end of a dowel to test the knife's edge, his movements slow and safe. He spoke to Ethan in a way that let Samantha hear without feeling pressured to respond. "Rounding it out isn't easy. You've got to find the right point of balance." "Yes, sir, I know. I'll take my time," Ethan replied. He gently rolled the unfinished wooden ball toward her. "You can try holding it steady if you want." Samantha didn't reach for it, but her small shoulders loosened slightly. A faint sound of footsteps came from the porch. Michael stopped, tilting his head to listen. A second step followed, slower. Then the sound of wind blocked at the roof's corner, the window rattling once before going still. Michael looked at Ethan and pointed toward the back room. "Take her inside now." Ethan got up quickly, still holding the wooden ball, glancing at her with a questioning look. Samantha stayed put, her feet rooted to the rug. Michael moved toward her, crouching so she wouldn't be startled. "Let's go inside, sweetheart." She gave a tiny shake of her head, her eyes locked on the front door. Then came the pounding firm and deliberate, like someone certain it would be opened, followed by silence. Michael straightened, slipped the small knife into his pocket, and reached for the handgun in the cabinet with his other hand. He motioned for Ethan to move further back, closing the inner door halfway for protection. Michael walked to the front door, stopping at an angle, his hand ready on the lock. "Who is it?" he called. A man's voice filtered through the wood, smooth but cold. "Victor Grant. I told you before, hand her over, and you'll be left alone." Michael didn't open the door. "No one here belongs to you." Outside, there was a quiet chuckle. Then another voice cut in, dry and tilted. "Derek Lawson here, don't waste his time." A shorter shadow shifted to the right. It had to be Travis Cole, silent as stone, his steps drawing closer to crowd the space. Michael slowed his breathing, slid the lower lock free, and took a quick glance through the thin curtain. On the porch stood the same three faces he'd seen the night before. Victor in the middle, hands in his pockets like a man out for a stroll. Derek tilting the rifle on his shoulder just enough to intimidate. Travis with his head lowered, one hand resting on the handle of his knife like a casual greeting. Michael spoke each word with precision. "Children are not merchandise. If you want peace, step off my porch." Victor stepped forward half a pace, speaking slowly so each word sank into the walls. "You have no idea how valuable she is. She has to go back." When he said the word has, Samantha suddenly shot to her feet. The chair legs scraped against the floor in a thin but sharp line of sound. She stepped off the edge of the rug, her small feet stopping right behind Michael, and her voice rang out hoarse and trembling but unbroken. "You don't own me." The air thickened for a second. Across the threshold, Victor's eyelid twitched in surprise. the corner of his mouth freezing mid-smile. Derek glanced quickly, his hand easing away from the rifle barrel as if afraid to touch something alive. Travis tilted his chin slightly, his eyes slipping through the crack in the door, searching the girl's face as though checking for a crack in an old wall. Michael didn't turn around. He spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "Stay behind me." Then he threw the top bolt hard, opening the door just wide enough for one hand. The barrel of his gun came up, his eyes locking squarely on Derek's chest. "Back away. Now." His voice wasn't loud, but it cut across every movement. Victor looked at the gun barrel, then into the man's eyes. He leaned his head back slightly and smiled again, this time thinner. "Thought the girl forgot how to talk. Fine. Then I'll make sure she remembers her place." He shifted his toe forward, but Michael stepped half a pace to block him. Ethan cracked the bedroom door open. He didn't speak, but he held up the small wooden ball as if to remind her she needed a point of balance. Samantha stood tall, clutching the stuffed bear so tightly her knuckles turned white, but her eyes no longer flinched. She repeated, slow and steady, "I do not belong to you." The words "belong to" made the porch floor seem to sway for an instant. Michael used the opening in Victor's gaze, pushing the door another few inches and dropping his tone low. "Get off my property. Now." He shifted the gun toward Travis, making it clear that if the knife left its sheath, he would fire. Derek lowered his shoulder slightly, as if looking for a safer place to rest his hands. Victor ran his tongue over his teeth, a flicker of genuine irritation in his eyes. He exhaled, tapping his fingertip on his cuff, as if counting to 3. "Fine. That's all for tonight." He tilted his head just enough for the wind to carry his next words. "But I told you before. I'll be back, and next time, I won't give warning." The 3 men backed off the porch. The crunch of their boots on gravel rumbled low, then faded, leaving only the pines whispering to each other like a thin, lingering promise. Michael slammed the door, slid all 3 locks into place, and pushed the heavy cabinet against it. Turning back, he looked at the 2 children. Ethan dropped the wooden ball onto the rug, swallowed hard, and pulled a blanket over her shoulders. Samantha remained standing, her eyes no longer avoiding his, her chest rising and falling but holding rhythm. The stuffed bear nestled into her shoulder, as if it were part of her body. Michael stepped toward her slowly. He didn't reach out to touch her, but he spoke in the tone of an adult teaching a short, important truth. "You spoke well. From now on, you stay behind me, and I'll take care of the rest." She looked at him, her eyes still carrying traces of fear, but now there was a thin line of light in them like a mark cut into stone to map the way forward. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the damp scent of the forest's edge. Inside, the fire crackled as if answering a new breath. And in that quiet moment, Michael knew they had crossed into another doorway, one where a child had just spoken the name of her own freedom for the first time. The morning lay still over the roof, sunlight coming in just enough. Ethan spread a small rug in the middle of the room and arranged the round wooden blocks into a circle. He glanced over and spoke slowly so as not to startle anyone. "Let's build a tower." Samantha held her teddy bear for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the pile of wood as if weighing the idea. Then she set the bear down beside a pillow, reached for one of the blocks, her hand trembling slightly but her eyes carrying a trace of curiosity. She placed the block on top. The tower swayed a little, then held. Ethan let out a soft breath and smiled. "That looks good." Out on the porch, Michael was chopping wood. He could hear the kids exchanging short, clipped sentences. "Put it here." "Yeah, it's steadier this way." He glanced through the window and saw Samantha's shoulders more relaxed than yesterday, while Ethan knew how to wait, no rushing, no pulling. That slow rhythm eased the tightness in the house, though inside Michael's chest a taut string still refused to loosen completely. Close to noon, a light knock came at the door. Michael wiped his hands, unlatched it, and opened it just a crack. On the porch stood Martha Jenkins, the middle-aged woman who sold goods at the Hope Street Market. She was short and sturdy, her hair neatly tied back, a basket of still warm conchas resting in her arms. She smiled warmly, eyes quick but kind. "I was passing by and thought I'd bring some bread for the kids. The roadside's dusty today, you must be tired from the trip back from the market." Michael thanked her, standing in the doorway so the room behind him stayed discreet. Martha tilted her head, catching sight of the little girl sitting on the rug with her teddy bear. A flicker of curiosity crossed her face before softening. "Who's this young lady? I don't think I've ever seen her with you and your boy before." Michael smiled politely. "She's my sister-in-law's niece, just staying with us for a bit to have some peace and quiet." Martha set the basket on the table, tugging her coat closed against the breeze. She didn't ask more, only said, "Make sure your doors are locked tight. Wind might change direction tonight. If you need anything, come by. My place is at the top of the hill." Before leaving, she glanced at the girl one more time, her voice dropping lower. Michael closed the door, turned, and handed the bread to the kids. Ethan broke off a small piece and set it near Samantha's hand. "This bread's really good." She looked at it for a moment, her left hand still resting on the teddy bear, then gave a small nod and pinched off the tiniest bite. Ethan didn't say anything else, just sat blowing on his own piece to cool it, eyes sneaking toward the wooden tower as if afraid it might topple. Michael made a round through the house, replacing the back door latch with a new one. He drilled a small hole into the frame to add another lock, the steady, short bursts of the drill like counting in his head. When he stood up to wash his hands, Ethan tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, she's finished her bread." Michael chuckled. "Give her another piece." The boy turned back, placed more bread on her plate, and whispered, "Here, eat this. I'll hold the tower for you." The afternoon moved slowly. Michael added more wood to the stove and sat closer, watching the girls' hands as they held a block. "If you want, you can try making a small cut. I'll keep your hand steady." Samantha looked at the blade for a moment, then shook her head. "Maybe later." She spoke very softly, but clearly. Ethan heard her, looked up, and nodded as if she'd just given him a promise. As the sunlight dipped behind the ridge, Martha Jenkins had long since disappeared beyond the trees. Ethan put away most of his toys, leaving the wooden tower in the corner of the rug like a little landmark. Samantha Brooks pulled her teddy bear close, sitting by the window for a short while, gazing out toward the strip of woods in front of the porch. Ethan sat beside her, legs swinging. She spoke softly, her voice as if afraid to break something fragile. "I know her. She came close to where I was being kept. Once, she sold bread near the trail." Ethan turned to her. "Did she say anything to you?" She shook her head. "She walked fast, didn't look for long. There was someone standing guard back then." Michael Carter heard it. He set the dish towel down on the table and looked straight out the window. In his mind, he pieced the fragments together, the sound of Victor Grant's voice at the market, the way people stepped aside, Martha Jenkins's basket of bread, and a trail he had never taken, not to suspect her, but to know which paths were open and which were closing. He turned back, his tone steady. "After dinner, I'm going to teach you both how to lock the latch from the inside quickly. Tomorrow, I'll go see Sheriff Daniel Hayes. For now, let's eat and get warm." Dinner was simple, just bean soup and bread, but the warmth spread through the room. Ethan spoke quietly, to make it light. "Let's make the wooden tower taller tomorrow." Samantha looked at the tower, her lips moving just slightly. "Tomorrow." Just one word, but it landed in the middle of the table like planting a seed. Night edged in. Michael turned off most of the lights, lingered a little longer than usual in front of the living room window, then pulled the curtain halfway down. Ethan spread his blanket and lay on his side, facing her. Samantha leaned against the wall, hugging her teddy bear, listening to the fireplace crackle. The wind shifted, just as Martha had said, bringing with it the damp scent of earth. Michael stepped out to the back porch to check the new latch, his boots pressing into the damp ground and leaving clear prints. He walked around the house, bent down to pick up a dry branch, and then stopped. Along the edge of the yard were other footprints, not his, pointed toward the house, with longer, deeper steps. The impressions were still wet, the mud not yet set, leading from the line of pines right up to the wall. He followed the trail, his heartbeat steady, until he saw them stop directly beneath the living room window at a spot where someone could place their hands on the sill and stand there for a long time. Michael straightened up. Through the fogged glass, he could make out the shapes of Ethan and the girl inside, both quiet within their small circle of light. He went back to the door, slid on an extra latch, and picked up the shovel he kept near the porch steps. Without waking the kids, he stepped inside, checked each lock once more, and sat down in the chair facing the window. His back rested against the seat, eyes fixed on the curtain frame. The sound of horse hooves rose from a distance, steady and heavy, as if someone was counting each stride. Michael shot to his feet, slid the doorbolt into place, grabbed his gun, and spoke quickly and firmly. "Ethan, get into the back room right now. Lock the door. Stay with Samantha." Ethan nodded and ran straight for the room, scooping up the wooden tower like a good luck charm. Michael crouched down and spoke to Samantha Brooks in a steady, deliberate tone. "Go with him into the room and lock the door. I'll be right here." The girl hesitated for half a beat, then back toward Ethan, still clutching her stuffed bear, her eyes fixed on the front door. Out on the porch, dark shapes spread into a loose circle. Victor Grant sat in the middle on horseback, his dark fur coat draped over his shoulders, eyes locked forward. On one side was Derek Lawson with a long rifle. On the other, Travis Cole, silent and heavyset, with a knife at his belt. A few more strangers held the horses toward the rear, their faces half covered by scarves. The night wind whipped across the porch, thin fog curling over the ground. Victor leaned forward in his saddle, his voice cutting toward the wooden door. "Send the girl out, or the boy takes her place." Michael stood at an angle from the door, his gun raised to chest height. "No one's taking anyone's place, and no one here belongs to you." After speaking, he shifted half a step to keep a line of sight into the back room, where Ethan had already thrown the lock and shoved a small dresser in front of the door. The breathing inside had gone quiet, leaving only the faint crackle of the fireplace. Victor gave a signal. The ring tightened. Travis stepped off the porch, hand resting on the knife handle, eyes glancing through a gap in the curtain as if measuring the distance. He lunged, blade flashing. Michael caught the movement. Raising his arm, steel scraped his sleeve as the knife sliced past. He was forced back against the wall, his left shoulder slamming into a post with a sharp thud. Travis was heavy and relentless, driving in with his whole body, the knife searching for an opening. Michael twisted aside, using the barrel of his gun to knock at Travis's wrist, but the man's momentum still pushed him back another half step. Derek seized the opening, swinging his rifle toward Ethan's door. "Open up," he growled, eyes locked on the wood. Michael saw the barrel pivot. He sprang from the wall, cutting across the porch at an angle, and rammed his shoulder into Derek's side. Both men crashed into the doorframe. Derek's rifle tore from his hands, skidding across the porch steps with a metallic scrape that startled the whole porch. Derek stumbled. Michael grabbed his collar, spun him, and shoved hard toward the yard. Derek went down in the thin snow, unable to catch himself, his shoulder twisting awkwardly. Travis had turned back, knife raised high. Just then, from the kitchen came the clang of heavy metal being lifted from its hook. Samantha darted through the doorway like a small shadow, her bare feet crunching the snow. She gripped a cast-iron skillet with both hands, pouring her weight into the swing. "Don't!" Her voice cracked, but the strike landed true. The skillet slammed squarely into Travis's shoulder with a dense, solid thud. His knife arm went numb, the blade spinning free, flipping once before planting itself into the porch's edge. Travis dropped to his knees, half collapsing forward, eyes rolling white from the blow. Victor shouted sharply, leaping from his saddle and pulling a handgun. Michael pivoted in time, bringing his gun up, the barrel aimed straight at Victor's chest. Their eyes locked for a long, taut beat. "Put the gun down," Michael said, each word slow and deliberate. Victor didn't comply. He raised his arm. Michael stomped his heel against the porch edge, slamming the half-open door hard to create space. The door edge whipped back, striking Victor squarely in the ribs. He staggered, boots slipping on the snow, a dry grunt tearing from his chest. The shot from his gun went wide, slamming into the roof and shattering a section of shingles. Losing balance, he pitched forward onto the steps, one knee smashing against the stone edge before his upper body hit the frozen ground. He groaned once, clutching his side, his breath ragged and uneven. Derek crawled toward the gun, but Michael was already there, the muzzle of his own weapon blocking the way. "Stop." His voice was low and heavy. Derek raised both hands, his gaze carrying a quiet, simmering hatred. One of the strangers holding the horses in back started forward, but the horses shrieked and stepped back, spooked by the smell of gunpowder and the clang of the skillet hitting the ground. The circle of men loosened, like a rope suddenly unknotted. Samantha stood there, breathing hard, both hands gripping the cast-iron skillet as if she were clinging to a tree branch in rushing water. Michael turned toward her, gave a short nod. "Good. Get behind me." She stepped back, eyes still locked on Travis. The stuffed bear lay sprawled in the doorway, dusted with a thin streak of snow. Victor struggled to push himself upright, his face pale with pain. Bracing a hand on the step, he stifled a groan. But the side of his coat was already darkened, the snow beneath his knees stained in a dirty patch. He looked up, forcing a crooked smile. "This isn't over." Michael kept his gun trained, stepping slowly toward the porch steps, his eyes issuing a clear warning to the rest of them. "Back away. Take your injured man and leave if you want to keep breathing." The sound of horse whistles rose in the distance, followed by the shouts of men from the upper end of town. A rider appeared in front, blowing short bursts on his whistle, with several townsmen behind him carrying torches and coils of rope. Among them was Frank Miller, the wiry owner of the general store, his sharp eyes decisive. "Who's causing trouble here?" he barked, his horse rearing as the torchlight swept over the gathered faces. Victor's crew glanced at one another, some backing away, others turning to leave. A few rushed to pull Travis to his feet and help Victor into the saddle. Derek clutched his shoulder, retreating toward the tree line, his eyes still fixed on the barrel of Michael's gun. With the pounding of hooves closing in, the circle broke apart like water split by a blade. Michael didn't give chase. He stepped back onto the porch, shielding the two children behind him. Frank Miller pulled his horse to a stop, his eyes scanning the churned snow and the shattered roof tile. He gave Michael a questioning look without speaking. Michael gave a short nod. "They'll be back." A cold gust kicked dust up onto the porch steps, the smell of gunpowder mingling with wood smoke. Ethan cracked the bedroom door open, glancing at his sister and then at the skillet. He swallowed hard. "Are you hurt?" Samantha shook her head, her breathing steadier now, though her hands still trembled around the skillet's handle. Michael's grip on the gun tightened, his heartbeat settling into a solid, deliberate rhythm, and he knew one thing with absolute clarity in that moment. The sky hadn't fully lightened when the sound of horses' hooves and short, sharp whistles cut into the stillness. Michael Carter opened the door, his hand steady on the lowered barrel of his gun. Standing on the porch was a middle-aged man in a dark leather jacket, a silver badge on his chest, dark circles under his eyes from many sleepless nights, but his gaze was direct and alert. He introduced himself briefly. Sheriff Daniel Hayes. Behind him were several mounted deputies leading a transport wagon. Victor Grant was in handcuffs, his face pale but his eyes still as sharp as blades. Derek Lawson's shoulder was wrapped in a bandage, and Travis Cole kept his head down, his hands bound tightly behind his back. Hayes stepped up one stair, his eyes sweeping over the scuffed porch boards, the broken roof tile, and the knife embedded in the wood trim. He gave a single nod, enough to show he understood. "We got reports from town residents, followed the boot tracks here. All three of them have outstanding warrants, plus multiple missing persons cases on file." He turned to Michael. "You did the right thing. You just shut down a major link in their chain." Michael lowered the barrel of his gun completely. "I just kept the kids safe." Hayes looked inside the house, where Ethan stood bracing the bedroom door, and Samantha Brooks clutched her teddy bear, eyes locked on the porch. He lowered his voice so she could hear without fear. "From here on, young lady, the police will take care of the rest." Victor shot her a sideways glare, a flash of hatred like a knife's edge. She stepped back half a pace but didn't bow her head. They escorted the three men to the transport wagon. Victor glanced back, his mouth curling into a crooked smile. "You think this is over?" Hayes cut him off, his voice flat as paper. "That's enough." He pushed Victor's head down toward the wagon floor and locked the latch. Once the door slammed shut, Hayes turned fully back to Michael. "I'm going to need your statement and the child's description too. But first, those kids need a meal and a few hours of sleep." Later that day, at the Riverton Town Hall, Hayes took a brief statement. He then called in a social worker, a short-haired woman with glasses named Rachel Cooper, whose voice was gentle and whose years of working with abused children showed in every movement. She didn't press with questions. Instead, she placed a warm glass of milk and a box of crayons in front of Samantha. "You can draw whatever you like. You don't have to talk if you don't want to." Samantha gripped a crayon and drew a small house, with 2 windows and a round shape in the middle of the porch. Ethan stood beside her and whispered, "That's our wood tower." In the afternoon, Hayes arranged for Michael to appear at the family court in Riverton. The courtroom was small, with white walls and tall windows. On the bench sat Judge Patricia Coleman, a slender woman with a voice that was few in words but clear in tone. She read quickly through the arrest records, the old warrants, Hayes's report, and Rachel's temporary assessment. Given the urgency and the risk of recurrence, the court hereby grants emergency legal guardianship to Mr. Michael Carter for the minor, Samantha Brooks. Adoption proceedings are to be opened immediately today, with priority handling under special provisions. The gavel struck once, firm and final. Michael straightened, looked toward Samantha, and gave a respectful nod. "Your Honor, I will take full responsibility." Rachel handed Michael the court order, giving a brief explanation of the next steps. "From now on, you are her legal guardian. We will conduct regular visits and provide psychological counseling for her. The most important thing is to keep her daily life stable. Michael nodded. I understand. My home has room for both kids, and the kitchen is always warm. Out in the hallway, Ethan ran over and grabbed Samantha's hand. You're safe now. She didn't answer, only tightened her grip, her fingernails pressing lightly into his skin as if to confirm that what she had just heard was real. Michael looked at those two small hands holding each other, and he felt his throat tighten with a deep and simple gratitude. Late that night, Sheriff Hayes drove them home. At the front door, he stopped to speak quietly to Michael. They still have people on the outside. Don't let your guard down. I'll have patrols in the area for the next few days. If you notice anything unusual, call me directly. He handed over a business card with his personal number on it. You should reinforce the windows with crossbars. Keep the back porch light on all night. Michael nodded. Thank you. Outside, the transport van carrying the prisoners rumbled down the slope. Fine dust lifted into the air, blurring part of the forest's edge. Out of habit, Michael looked out one last time. At the tree line, not far from the road, a lone figure stood motionless, hands in his pockets, his face hidden in the shadows of the leaves. His gaze was ice-cold and unblinking, as if he were committing to memory the path to the house and the number of steps from the gate to the front door. The next morning, the air inside the house felt a little lighter. Sheriff Daniel Hayes had assigned people to patrol the perimeter, while Michael Carter reinforced the window with an extra crossbar and hung an oil lamp at the back of the house to keep burning until late at night. When the sun rose to the height of the pine tops, he carried a hoe out to the patch of soil in front of the porch and called to the two children. Come on out. I'm going to teach you how to plant a few rows of vegetables. The soil was still damp, cool as water. Ethan Carter worked the earth in the left corner, while Samantha Brooks stood on the right, clutching her teddy bear for a moment before setting it on the porch step so it wouldn't get in the way. Michael handed her a handful of bean seeds and a few cilantro seeds, speaking slowly so she'd remember. Place each seed in the soil, not too deep, so it can breathe. She bent down, her fingers brushing the earth so lightly, each seed falling neatly into the row. She asked in a small voice, steadier than the day before, "What if the seeds don't sprout?" Michael smiled. "Then we plant them again, as long as the soil is warm and we're patient." She nodded, her eyes no longer darting away but looking straight at the garden bed, as if she were looking at a promise. By noon, Michael was teaching them how to start a fire on the old griddle. He stacked the small pieces of wood into a teepee shape and told Ethan to light the kindling. As the flames began to climb, Samantha stepped back half a pace but didn't look away. "When the fire gets weak, put another stick here, but don't let the flames eat up all the air," Michael said, guiding her hands on the tongs so she could feel how firm but gentle her grip should be. Samantha repeated the steps once, her voice clearer this time. "If there's dry wood and just the right amount of air, the fire will stay steady." Ethan nudged her playfully and chuckled. "You sound like a little old lady." She gave a small but certain smile. That afternoon, she sat alone at the table with a small piece of wood and a thin carving knife in front of her. Michael didn't push her. He simply worked on fixing a latch while Ethan played on the rug. A while later, she placed something in Michael's hand, a piece of wood she had carved. 3 figures stood side by side, one tall and 2 smaller, with a single line at their feet like the porch step. She spoke softly, almost just for the 3 of them to hear. "This is a family." Michael held the carving in his palm, a warm ache rising at the corner of his eyes. He spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "Thank you. I'll keep it on the windowsill so I can see it every morning." Ethan ran over immediately, turning the carved wooden piece in his hands as if he'd just made a great discovery. "Dad, this morning she beat me at the block tower. She put the top piece on and it didn't fall." Michael ruffled both their hair and let out a soft chuckle. "Then tomorrow we'll build it even taller. But don't forget you need a solid base." Ethan nodded seriously, then pulled her over to the rug to rebuild the tower. Samantha no longer clutched her teddy bear. Instead, she used both hands to lift the top piece into place, searching for the right spot, her eyes focused as if she were stitching a straight seam. When the fire in the stove glowed red with heat, Michael leaned back against the wall, his gaze drifting out toward the porch. He felt part of the weight on his shoulders ease, as if an old backpack had finally been set down. The years in the service and the empty stretch of life that followed still left their marks, but the sound of children's voices and the smell of baking bread were slowly covering the echoes of the past. He understood then that the girl's presence wasn't just about saving someone, it was also about saving himself from the silent room he once lived in. Later in the afternoon, Rachel Cooper stopped by briefly to drop off some counseling forms and remind him of the next home visit. She smiled at Samantha without asking much, simply placing a box of new colored pencils on the table. "Whenever you feel like drawing more, you can." Samantha accepted them and gave a small nod, like a quiet thank you. Evening came slowly. Ethan tidied up the tower and laid out a blanket near the fireplace, while Samantha carried the family carving to the windowsill, just as Michael had suggested. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the edge of the wood as if making sure it stayed steady. Michael took a bucket out to the well and called back to them, "Once I'm done drawing water, you both come inside." The next morning, Michael Carter brought the slip of paper to the town hall. Sheriff Daniel Hayes welcomed him into his small office, where a map of the forest and a stack of open case files lay on the desk. Beside him stood a young female officer with her hair neatly tied back, her gaze sharp yet composed. "This is Deputy Lauren Scott," Hayes introduced. "She'll be in charge of patrolling the Pinewood cabin area." Michael placed the slip of paper on the desk and explained exactly when he had found it. Hayes studied it carefully, giving a short, firm nod. "This message is genuine. We'll widen the investigation, sweep the trails around the Redwood State Forest, and check any abandoned storage buildings. Tonight, I'm increasing the patrol frequency. Your family will be protected." He handed Michael a small steel whistle and a new direct contact number. "If you hear anything unusual, blow 3 short blasts. Deputy Scott's unit will respond immediately." On the way back, the early wind was dry and light. Michael stopped at Martha Jenkins' market stall, bought some flour and milk, and thanked her for the basket of pastries she had given the day before. She simply waved her hand. "As long as the kids are eating, that's all that matters." Then she glanced toward the forest, her voice dropping lower. "Make sure those doors are locked tight." Michael nodded and continued on his way, already organizing the afternoon's tasks in his mind. Replace the window latches, check the fence line, and teach the 2 kids how to call for each other in case of an emergency. The afternoon passed quietly. Michael replaced the window latch, added a crossbar just as Sheriff Hayes had advised, and then set the carved wooden piece on the windowsill. The slanted glow of sunset spilled in, honey-colored light covering the 3 roughly carved yet warm figures. He stood still for a moment, feeling his chest loosen, as if another window had been opened inside him. He remembered that first afternoon at Pinewood Cabin, the smell of damp wood, the moldy bowl of rice, and those terrified eyes, and then looked at the 2 children now curiously examining the steel whistle on the table. He realized that the emptiness inside him had been filled with small things, solid things. By nightfall, the fire in the stove burned steadily. Ethan shared out the bread, Samantha poured the milk, and the 2 of them argued playfully over who had won in yesterday's wooden tower game. Michael sat on the porch listening to their banter, then laughed out loud. "Come inside, it's getting dark," he called gently. The 2 ran in, still laughing. Once they were lying down, Michael pulled up their blankets and wished them good night. He lingered by the window, looking out over the yard as it grew darker. Out there, a cluster of fireflies blinked on and off, like they were keeping time for a silent song. He turned away, resting his hand on the carved wooden piece on the windowsill, hearing the house breathe in the sound of wood contracting in the cool night. From the edge of the Redwood State Forest, a faint snap of a branch reached his ears. Michael didn't turn to look. Instead, he checked the latch once more with his fingertips, dimmed the lights, and walked toward the 2 children. He knew tomorrow might bring more to face, but for now, in this very moment, they were strong enough to get through it together. He sat down in the chair, his eyes drifting to the windowsill where the last trace of sunset clung to the family carving, making it glow for just a second before softening. Inside him, an old thought returned, clear as if it had just been etched into the wood. "With $1, I bought a home, and a reason to live." The story has ended, but its echoes will linger for a long time. $1 bought a house, and courage saved a life. Michael Carter was not a cape-wearing hero, just a single father who chose to do the right thing. Victor Grant and his accomplices would eventually pay the price, while Samantha Brooks, Ethan Carter, and that little house had a brand new beginning. The world can be cold at times, but justice never goes out, and kindness always finds its way home. What do you think of the choice that single father made? If it were you, what would you do when standing before a door with the sound of muffled sobs in the dark? Which detail touched you the most, the words, "You don't own me," the cast iron skillet, or the small wooden carving of family? Do you believe that when good people stand firm, the bad ones will eventually be brought to justice? For me, what remains is not only the victory of the law, but the habit of daily kindness. A warm meal, a hand to hold, a gentle reminder that you're safe now. Are you willing to bring that habit into your own home, your own neighborhood? If you've ever witnessed or gone through something similar, you can share it in the comments. Your story might give strength to someone who needs it. And let me ask you this: how are you today? Are you tired? Have you eaten something warm? If your heart feels heavy, take a slow breath and remember you are not alone here. Thank you for listening until the very end. If you found this meaningful, I invite you to share your thoughts, hit the like button, and follow the channel so we can continue telling stories where good is rewarded and evil must bow its head before justice.